Today, students, we're going to go over a tool called the value check. You'll hear me say this in class frequently. The value check is a tool that you as the student use early in your piece, in the middle, and at the end as well. It's something you just kind of do as you work. Whether you're working in color or black and white, it's important to make sure that your contrast is strong in your piece. The way that you check your values is that you create a brand new layer, put it at the very top of your layer order, paint bucket it solid black, and right here, you set the blending mode to saturation. It allows you to see your piece in black and white. This dark blue becomes dark gray. Light blue, light gray. When you do a value check, it's also important that you give it a 10-foot check. You zoom out to look at the whole piece and all the different value components in it together. So let's say we were going to render these two spheres. What would be a good value balance? Well, first we need to understand how value works. Values range from white to black. And if you're making a painting, a general rule of thumb is to avoid solid white and solid black. As beginners, you generally want to work within this range of value. When you add white and when you add black, depends on other factors. So white would be for very hot highlights, and black would be for contact shadows and ambient occlusion. Creases, folds, where the figure comes into direct contact with a surface when casting a shadow. So let's take this light blue sphere and shade it. Well, the question is how do you know how dark to go and how do you know how light to go on something? Well, that's called local value. Local value means what is the true value of the object that we're trying to shade? This local value is actually pretty light, whereas this local value is actually pretty dark. That's where the value check comes in. If we go to black and white, we can look at the local value and compare that to where it falls on this value chart. So here's a little trick that you can do. Turn on your value check layer. Click over here on your color picker and then sample the midtone of the form. And if we sample the gray, you'll see that the gray falls right about here, falls right here on the value scale. This is about like a 30 or 40%. If we sample the local value here, it's way darker. So I'm going to introduce you guys to a formula called the half to black formula. The way half to black works means that if your value's in the middle, you will go halfway near down to black and then halfway to white. That means if your midtone is here, you're going to use a value range all the way from 10% to 90%. So if we sample this midtone and we see that it falls above midline, that means we're going to get all the way to light gray and then go down to dark gray. So if the midtone falls here, the darkest we're going to get is down to 80, and we don't always go, and we won't go all the way to white, so we'll go all the way up to 10. So when I pick my color, I'll go down to about here. That's the darkest area, and my lightest will go up to about here. And if you're working with color, remember that light desaturates, it adds white, okay, and shadow saturates. So I'll pull my shadow down to about here, and I'll have my light generally about up to here. Okay, so I've added value to this sphere, and let's check our values to make sure that our contrast looks good, that it works. I'm going to turn on my value check layer, and it converts it to black and white. Now, using our color picker, I'm going to sample the lightest area. Good, it's not absolute white. There's no hot highlights painted yet. That's good. And now the absolute darkest area. Right over here, I've got a darker, kind of a navy blue midtone. What will the value range be for that? Well, let's turn on our value check and see. That's what the midtone is. Use your color picker, sample it, and you see we're falling down here to about like the 70 to 80% range. Okay, so that means if this is all the way to black, then halfway to it would be your brightest area might be up in the 50% range, 50 to 40%. So that means I have way fewer bright values to use. So you see the value range is way more compressed. Also, it's probably hard to see against a white background. That's why I strongly recommend to my students that you paint on a gray midtone background. A midtone gives you a middle value range that you can more clearly compare and contrast your values with. If you're up against white, now everything on this sphere looks a whole lot darker, right? If you're up against middle gray, now you see a wider spectrum of value. Here's the brightest point. Bingo, right about in the area that we calculated. And the darkest. A little bit too dark. One of the ways we can solve that is go in and just lighten it up a bit. Now we check, and our values are not black. So That is how you do a value check using local value. I've got one little area of concern here with a value check. Do you see how the value of this area here is getting kind of muddy? That means that the gray and the gray of the main object, they're starting to blend together, which means for effect, I'm gonna probably need to put something lighter in between the background and the form here so that they separate. And then go ahead and add a little presentation like this to the piece, just to kind of frame it. Zoom out, and if it looks a little bit too heavy, still, we can take the opacity of that layer and turn it down a little bit, just to give it some effect. What's it look like in color? Looks pretty decent. Background, vignette, major form, value check, all right? Gray, lighter gray, gray. It solved our contrast problem. All right, so this is how a value check works. I look forward to seeing you use this in your work religiously at all stages for good contrast. Hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you in class. Take care.